you have taken an approach to the teaching of reading based on the work of Christopher Such. You had access to his ideas just before they were published, and so that helped shape how you do things at your school. And I thought it'd be really good to explore what that looks like after 2 and a bit years. So I think it makes sense for the first question to be, what have you done?
Like you said, Kieran, I was very fortunate to have an early access to Chris's thinking, really. And it was quite clear at the time of him writing that that book was very much needed for the primary sector, as we've mentioned before on the podcast. And I came to the school and taking the first look at kind of what was going on with reading, it was a mishmash of viper's hell, to be quite honest with you. And it didn't really have any clear direction. It felt a bit like everything was a bit flash in the pan. It's not to say people weren't trying really hard with things, because I like the staff of my school do try really, really hard with things, and they were giving it the best go. We just didn't have a really clear kind of a way. We try and everything we do, we try and embody like the Staplehurst way. And everything we do is this is how we do it, and try and put our stamp on things. I think it's really important as well, like when you're considering implementing things in a school, is that you make things your own and you make it your way. And that might be some slight deviations from contextual deviations from the like core implementation, but not too far. We'll talk about that a bit later on. But like you do need to contextualize and make it yours. And Chris was incredibly supportive in the process, and I kind of said to him early on, look, we need to do this, because I identified it was early on, and we needed to move quickly on it, because it was in the middle of lockdown, and that there were pros and cons to that. It kind of gave us a little bit of thinking space and a bit of room to maneuver, if you will. So at times are a little bit different, as we all experienced, but it was really important actually for us that we had that maneuverability, and then Chris's support as well. And I said to him, I want to be an early adopter of this, and because as we know, that is quite seminal now already, that work. And I think like we knew straight away from reading it. I was like, oh my days, this is what we've needed in the sector for like a long time. And it just made complete sense. So I wanted to get going on it. Now, looking back at it, we did have to move quicker, because we were imminent Ofsted, and we were a requires improvement school, which that has implications. However, my mantra is always about long, steady, carefully implemented interventions. Whatever it is you're trying to do it carefully, and do it at a reasonable pace. Now, looking back at this, are there things I would have changed about the way we implemented it? Perhaps, but we were in a very strange time, and we were all doing the best we could, I think. So, but I think it's important to caveat kind of what I explained today with a little bit of that, that we just need to remember the time this was done, and kind of and how that kind of context affected the pace of implementation, I should say. So having looked at it and sort of thought, right, it's not really in the place we needed to be, and with reading being at the core of the framework, and so vitally important in schools for every subject, I knew we had to act quite quickly on this. And this was one that didn't fall into my sort of strategic curriculum development plan. This was a pick up and attack kind of subject, which sometimes I feel there is a place for a pick up and attack, and you have to do that if your core stuff is needing that attention, then attack it, because that stuff's got to be in place before you start jazzing up your history. I don't, I think we know that it all leads from reading. So having looked at what our offer was, and our kind of our culture and our reading diet, it was clear that there was just no real consensus across the staff as to like what the approach was and like why. It was the why that was missing. And actually, I don't know that at the time when I first saw it, that I had the why, because like I don't think anybody had outlined properly the why. The why at the time was, as like Chris and Neil have alluded to in previous episodes, was like SATs and the kind of manufactured kind of inference question cycle, you know, that had kind of developed into this like sort of beast that had invaded every school in the land, and that was what they were my mental models. So I was kind of thinking to myself, okay, I sort of understand what you're trying to do here, but this still lacks a little bit of like rationale for me, and like I can't quite see the vision of this subject and like what's going on here. And then Chris's book, well, he decided to write it. We egged him on to write it, and he wrote it, and it just beautifully synthesized all of the research and presented me the answer, you know, to what was needed to as a solution to kind of really remedy the sort of the lack of kind of rationale and the lack of direction for reading in the school. I think that's important to say, is that, you know, and I must say this, like, you know, I'm not for 1 minute saying that the teachers weren't working hard or doing a good job at what they were doing. They were. It's just the kind of the top down view of reading in the school wasn't, you know, it was just disorganized, and that kind of rigor, which I'll talk about later on, which the approach really employs, was lacking. So we decided to crack straight on with training our teachers up as best we could in the lockdown. A lot of it was done remotely, and we did it as much as we could in the first instance of laying all the theoretical side of things down. And then when we were able to get back into school and school started to return to normal, and we were able to actually practice things and able to try things out and start to really work with children, then we were able to sort of really establish our canon for reading and our sort of reading behaviors and the structures of our lessons and how it's all organized and laid out in his book, and put it to task and start to sort of see what worked, what didn't work. And it was really useful because I was able to use Chris as a sounding board during this, which I think he found quite useful as well, in a way that it was feedback for him about from the ground, kind of as to what it looked like what, you know, a scaled kind of implementation of his approach looked like, and like what were the teething problems, because there always is, isn't it? We know when we do any implementation, we've got a factor for a bit of flex and responsiveness with the active ingredients to ensure that we sort of mitigate the things that pop up in front of us that we perhaps couldn't have seen when we did all our planning and sort of laid the kind of pathway out for staff before. So it started to become quite clear what we needed to address and how we needed to move on it. But my reading lead at the time, Alina, she's since moved on to another school now. She's taken on an early years lead role. She's a fantastic practitioner and a fantastic reading lead at that. And she drove this with me, and her attention to detail and her ability to close loops is what I'm going to say. Her ability to close a loop, it was astonishing. Like, she just knew how to follow up, and not in a kind of draconian way, but in a, oh yeah, do you need a bit more support with that? Oh, we checked in on that last week. I'm just going to pop back, you know, and using a leadership time every week religiously to follow up. And that kind of low stakes loop closing was instrumental in how we moved the reading forward. So over that period of kind of a year and a half, I want to say, after the lockdown, where we were able to get back on the ground and really start practicing our reading behaviors and our, you know, all of those sessions and bedding them in. And she was just there to be able to land it and alongside me. So we were able to QA and land it and work on it as it went, and then able to get those structures in. And I think staff were, they were just really, they were happy. They were really pleased to see a real clear approach and support. And I think the follow-up support as well, which was so important to land something like that, because it's big, like you're talking a subject you're going to teach every day for at least half an hour. That's a big implementation, isn't it? We know, like, we're not just talking about perhaps history, which is done an hour a week or whatever. We're talking about a substantial subject here. So staff were obviously a little bit nervous to begin with, but we then moved to embedding all of the structures, all of the reading structures, and we did that in a phased way, which I'll talk about later on. But we moved to embed the whole of the approach, and teachers bought in, and that's kind of what the journey the school went on. We'd come from this place where we were a bit rudderless, to a point where we were sailing, we were really on our way. And it felt like that, it really kind of felt like that, walking around the school and talking to people. There was a kind of feeling of like, oh yeah, like reading. I had like teaching assistants asking me if they could have a copy of Chris's book and things, because they were so interested in the kind of direction that the reading was going. And I think that's testament to the quality of the approach, really. So
no teaching assistants asked if they want a copy of my book. No,
yours had sold out, mate. So
disappointing. I mean, in all seriousness, I think this speaks to why the conversation about implementation is perhaps not as developed as other parts of the discourse on education. Because, right, if I followed you correctly through that, you've identified what it was you wanted to change and how you want to change it. You've then clarified it. You've explained it and perhaps modeled it virtually because of the sort of constraints of the time. You've tested it. You've followed up. You've made incremental improvements. You developed it, and then you've embedded it. And that doesn't fit on a poster. And so, maybe it does, but people like threes, and they remember threes. You've got quite a few things there to think about, and it just shows, it's not messy, but it's not succinct either. There's a lot to that.